Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosopher's Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. In a previous work, I discussed René Descartes' method of doubt as presented in his Meditations on First Philosophy. Here I will for the most part depart from his methodology and theory of knowledge and go into his theory of what exists and its nature through some of Descartes' other works, namely the Principles of Philosophy, published in 1644, and the Passions of the Soul, published in 1649. In these books emerges his vision of a clockwork universe created by God and containing material objects as well as minds. We will also discuss the famous Cartesian Dualism, with its mind-body connection, innate ideas, and free will. Descartes starts his discussion of the will by giving it a larger domain than that of perception. The perceptions are composed of sensations, imagination, and pure understanding, while volition includes desire, aversion, assertion, denial, and doubt. Because the modes of willing include the formation of judgments, the will is also required for this intellectual function, in addition to the intellect itself. This broader scope of the will is what Descartes uses to justify his assertion that it is the will that is at fault when we fall into error. It is because the perception of the intellect is limited to only a few objects. The will, by contrast, is in some sense infinite, for it can extend to anything that can possibly be an object of another's will, including God's. This leads to Descartes' claim that, as he says in Part 1 of his Principles of Philosophy, the supreme perfection of man is that he acts freely or voluntarily. We do not praise automatons for doing what they are designed to do, but give credit instead to the designer. Also, when we embrace truth, it is more to our credit. However, when we are in error, it is a defect in the way we act or make use of freedom. It is not a contradiction to say that even in intellectual judgment errors, where clearly someone does not choose to go wrong, our will is nevertheless the cause of error. In terms of proof, he regards the freedom of the will as self-evident. In his own words, in section 39, he says that there is freedom in our will, and that we have power in many cases to give or withhold our assent at will, is so evident that it must be counted among the first and most common notions that are innate in us. What Descartes turns out to mean when he calls a notion innate is not that we are born with any conscious belief, but rather that we commonly assent to an idea when we come to understand it, because it makes sense immediately. He also describes the innate idea as seeing that we have the faculty within ourselves of summoning up the idea that is innate, although it is not always present to us. In his 1647 Comments on a Certain Broadsheet, Descartes deals with an objection to his theory to the effect that innate ideas are not needed. The counter-theory presented to him is that the power of thinking is sufficient because all common notions are engraved in the mind from observation or from verbal instruction. He counters that it is absurd to suggest that the power of thought could achieve nothing on its own without verbal instruction or assistance from the senses. In his view, the scope of the senses is limited, and it is not identical to what reaches the faculty of thinking by way of them. The sense organs only give us certain corporeal motions, but the motions and figures conceived by us are not the motions and figures that are in the sense organs. Pains, colors, and sounds in perception do not match what enters the sense organs. He draws the conclusion that the motions in the figures are innate in us. Motion, color, and figure are not directly associated with a belief like free will is, but they are also notions we have a faculty to summon. Yet the freedom of the will presents us with an apparent mystery of how we can have such a thing when we are created by an omniscient and omnipotent God. According to Descartes, everything must have been preordained by God. Due to his infinitude, he would know in advance from eternity whatever is or can be, and also will it. Descartes makes it clear that this would apply to our own actions as well when he says of God that we perceive in him a power so immeasurable that we regard it as impious to suppose that we could ever do anything which was not already preordained by him. The way Descartes proposes to reconcile human freedom with divine predetermination is to say that as finite beings, we do not understand how God leaves us the power of choice. He argues that we have an intimate grasp of our freedom, and it would be absurd to doubt it on the basis of something else being beyond our comprehension. This is not the only time Descartes has shown himself content to let something paradoxical about God and his relation to us remain a mystery. In the Meditations, he also lets it remain a mystery how God is most perfect, despite having created beings that are not perfect. As for the question of what there is, or the content of the furniture of the universe, Descartes will have God and two types of substances, which will turn out to be thinking substance and extended substance, mind and body. He defines a substance as a thing that exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing for its existence. Another thing may be the cause of the existence of a substance, but a substance does not depend upon it for continuing existence. There is a sense in which, strictly speaking, this would mean that only God can be a substance, because it is only with God's concurrence that other things exist. For Descartes, the way to simply resolve this is to say that the term substance does not apply univocally to God and his creations, but it will apply univocally to mind and body, which only require God's concurrence to exist. These substances will have their own qualities and attributes, and can be known through their attributes. When Descartes talks about substances and their attributes, he will argue from what is clearly intelligible to us and what is not. For validity, a kind of intelligibility criterion has previously been employed in the Meditations in the form of clear and distinct ideas being true. To be fair, though, it is not intelligibility alone, for we must have a clear and distinct idea of something's truth, with awareness of evidence helping us. And as to what that means, he says in section 45, a perception which can serve as the basis for a certain and indubitable judgment needs to be not merely clear, but also distinct. I call a perception clear when it is present and accessible to the attentive mind, just as we say that we see something clearly when it is present to the eye's gaze and stimulates it with a sufficient degree of strength and accessibility. I call a perception distinct if, as well as being clear, it is so sharply separated from all other perceptions that it contains within itself only what is clear. Ultimately, it will mean looking into what allows a clear and distinct perception to occur. Pain and color are examples of sensations that are clearly and distinctly perceived when we regard them as sensations or thoughts, rather than as real things existing outside of the mind. When I say that my pen is golden in color, it becomes an unintelligible idea if I conceive this as meaning that gold color is some kind of property that inheres in the pen. It will in fact appear black when all the lights are off. There may be a property in the pen that reflects light at a certain wavelength, but the sensation of golden color still exists only in the mind. In the case of pain, if someone says he feels pain in a limb, he feels something without knowing exactly what he feels. If an unseen mosquito bites my arm, I only discover what I am feeling when I look and see its cause. Sensations of pain are in the mind, as further evidenced by amputees who feel sensations associated with a limb that is no longer there. By contrast, we come to know sizes and shapes in a different way. It is a distinction between what we know from features of bodies that we clearly perceive and what must be referred to the senses. Our knowledge of what it is for a body to have a shape is much more clear than our knowledge of what it means for a body to be colored. When we perceive size, shape, and number, we directly perceive them to be actually, or at least possibly present in the object in a way that corresponds to our perception or understanding. To avoid error in the case of color, smell, taste, pain, we must simply say that there is something in the object, the nature of which we do not know, that is the source of the sensation. The purpose of this precaution is to ensure that we do not mistakenly attribute to a substance some quality or attribute that does not inhere in it, and possibly mistake the true nature or essence of that substance. Now we come to Descartes' argument for thought and extension as the essences of the two types of substance. Since nothingness possesses no attributes, the presence of an attribute indicates that there exists some thing or substance to which it can be attributed. We can easily come to know a substance through one of its attributes. Each substance will have a particular property that constitutes its nature and essence, with all other properties referring to that essence. Corporeal substance has length, breadth, and depth. Anything else that can be attributed to a body presupposes extension. Shape is unintelligible except in an extended thing. Motion must occur within an extended space. The mind has various modes of thought, including imagination and sensation, that cannot be imagined without thought. We thus end up with two clear and distinct notions of created thinking substance and corporeal extended substance, in addition to that uncreated substance that we call God. Thought and extension are the natures of intelligent and corporeal substances. They must be thought of as mind and body. It is easier to understand thinking and extended substance than to try to understand substance as such that is not thinking or extended. We have difficulty abstracting the notion of substance from the notions of thought or extension because the distinction is only conceptual. Thought and extension must be modes of substance. One mind may have different thoughts, and one body may be extended in different ways with its quantity unchanged, such as a piece of wax. Our understanding of thought and extension will be possible only if they are thought of as modes of a substance. As for the meaning of their being modes, it is the same meaning of a quality or attribute that is employed to allow us to think of the thing as being modified or affected. Thinking of thought and extension as modes allows us to distinguish them from the substance, because apart from the substance, thought and extension would become things. The modes of thought will be understanding, imagination, memory, and volition. The modes of extension will be shape, position of parts, and motion of the parts. We come to our best perception of these when we regard them as modes of the things in which they are located. Descartes starts part 2 of the principles regarding material things with a short summary of how we know that material things do exist. A short version is that we have a clear and distinct idea of an extended thing, with the involuntary sensations associated with it coming from without. The extension of a human body conjoined with the mind as no other object is evident from pain and other sensations that do not come from the mind alone. These sensations, however, only tell us what is beneficial or harmful to the combination of body and mind. Sensations do not also show us the nature of material bodies in themselves. Now Descartes will proceed further with his idea of extension being the essential mode of material substance, and how it compares to the idea of space. It will turn out the nature of both matter and space is a three-dimensional extension of length, breadth, and depth. This may seem strange at first because we generally do think of objects and empty space as being quite different from each other, but they differ in non-essential ways. Other qualities like weight, hardness, and color cannot be essential to material substances. Hardness only tells us that something resists penetration. Weight and color are perceived as something being incorporeal matter that can be removed while the object remains intact. Our notions of material objects do not depend on qualities. This gives further indication of extension being the essential mode. According to Descartes, the truth of all this gets obscured by two preconceived notions. The first is that rarefaction and condensation make an object appear more or less extended. The second is that where nothing is present, we say that there is empty space. Resolving these misconceptions will be especially important to Descartes, not just in terms of the nature of extension in space, but also in trying to explain how mind and body could ever communicate and affect each other. First, to deal with rarefaction. Imagine a sponge that you dip into water and then take out and squeeze dry. It appears as if it changes its size or quantity in terms of what volume of space it occupies when it alternates between water and air filling the holes and gaps. Descartes argues that this explanation, that the extension or volume of space is changed, is unintelligible. Instead, he insists that the pores and gaps being occupied by other bodies does not alter the extension of the rarefied thing. He says in Part 2, Section 6, now in this condition, the extension of a body is no less than when it occupies more space in virtue of the mutual separation of its parts. For whatever extension is comprised in the pores or gaps left between the parts must be attributed not to the body itself, but to the various other bodies which fill the gaps. In just the same way, when we see a sponge filled with water or some other liquid, we do not suppose that in terms of its own individual parts, it has a greater extension than when it is squeezed dry. We simply suppose that its pores are open wider so that it spreads over a greater space. Descartes holds that this is the only intelligible way to explain rarefaction. He says it is a contradiction to argue that something should be augmented by a new quantity or new extension without an extended substance being added. The new thing would have quantity and extension. As for the difference between quantity and extension, it is merely conceptual. We can imagine an object that occupies 10 feet of space. We can also think of just 10, without it being 10 of anything in particular. But a continuous quantity of 10 feet is not intelligible without 10 feet of some extended substance. Any removal would have to be two-way. Remove the 10 feet or the substance, and the other is also gone. A corporeal extension cannot be distinguished from its quantity. If we conceive of it in an alternative way, corporeal substance becomes incorporeal. So now we have more confirmation that extension is an essential mode of material substance, in that corporeal substance cannot be distinguished from its quantity or extension. It will be a similarity that it has with space. Descartes asserts that there is no real distinction between space or internal place and a substance. The extension of length, breadth, and depth that constitutes space is the same as that which constitutes the body. The difference that arises is that body is the extension of something particular, while we attribute to space a generic unity. When a body occupies a space, its extension in the space is thought not to change, and it retains the same position relative to other bodies. This extension can be recognized as the nature of both corporeal substances and of space. We only conceive of the two differently. Now one might ask what would happen if a corporeal thing, such as a stone, were to be removed. According to Descartes, the extension of the place that the item used to occupy remains the same, but is now occupied by wood, water, air, or the space that may be supposed to be empty. And so he concludes in section 13 of part 2. He says the terms place and space, then, do not signify anything different from the body which is said to be in a place. They merely refer to its size, shape, and position relative to other bodies. Descartes gives some further argument and clarification in terms of explaining what is meant by a place and position relative to other objects. A sternsman on a ship remains stationary relative to the other parts of the ship, but is moving relative to the shores. If the ship's movement should correspond to the rotation of the earth, it would be stationary relative to the position of the heavens. Place will indicate position, while space will indicate size and shape. When an object alters its position, we say that its place has changed. An object that is not of the same size and shape as what it replaces does not occupy the same space. An internal place then ends up being the same as space. Therefore, we always take space to be an extension of the three available dimensions. As for the space external to an object, it is the surface immediately surrounding it, a boundary between surrounding and surrounded objects. These considerations about space, matter, and extension, constituting the essence of both, will allow Descartes to draw a few more conclusions about the universe we see around us. In an ultimate sense, where he is going in general with this is to make the items of his clockwork universe quantifiable, subject to pure mathematics and geometry and their demonstrations. He says in section 64, I freely acknowledge that I recognize no matter in corporeal things, apart from that which the geometers call quantity, and take as the object of their demonstrations, i.e., that to which every kind of division, shape, and motion is applicable. This is the general direction, with a few interesting inferences as applications. According to Descartes, there can be no such thing as a vacuum in a philosophical sense, as that in which there is no substance. The very idea involves a contradiction because there is no real distinction between the extension of space or internal place and the extension of a body. Rather than empty space being devoid of anything, we will regard an empty pitcher as being filled with air that we do not perceive, rather than having the term empty indicating the absence of everything. A confusion is being created by the fact that we normally focus on what we can perceive. The concavity of a drinking goblet cannot be thought without the extension contained in it. If nothing else, it is filled with air because nothingness cannot have extension. If God were to remove all contents, including what we cannot perceive, the sides of the vessel would then have to come into contact. Another way of arguing this that Descartes does not use is to say that air takes up space. We can see this by squeezing a shampoo bottle, closing the lid, and seeing that the bottle retains the contracted shape until we open the lid and let the air back in. In a similar way, the extension of space being the same as that of material substance means that no matter what heavy or light material we choose, the vessel will not contain more substance than when it is filled with air. So also, rarefaction cannot be explained in any manner other than in the way previously described. Descartes also argues that there are existing particles that are too small for us to perceive. This rests on two premises. The first is that it does an injustice to reason to suggest that what can be known can only be restricted to what we can perceive. The second is that when something grows or shrinks, something must be added or subtracted. A tree grows day by day without us seeing the addition, but we know it must be there. Given these considerations, it should not be a surprise that minute bodies we cannot perceive should exist. But Descartes here introduces a surprising twist in wanting to use large objects as examples to know what happens in the small bodies. He says in Part 4, Section 201, he says, no one who uses his reason will, I think, deny the advantage of using what happens in large bodies, as perceived by our senses, as a model for our ideas about what happens in tiny bodies which elude our senses merely because of their small size. He says this approach is better than what he calls inventing strange objects, such as prime matter and substantial forms. So what then about atoms? One might expect that Descartes might be friendly toward the theory of the ancient Greek Democritus, who imagined that bodies large enough to be visible to us arise from the conglomeration and interaction of these corpuscles. The similarity is undeniable, with both philosophers allowing for particles so small that they elude the senses. Descartes instead denied the reality of atoms, and in doing so, he was not going against the scientific knowledge of his time. What we now call chemistry would advance later. I think there is an important lesson here about philosophy to be learned, from an example of a later developed science coming on side, at least to some degree, with the more ancient philosopher. The new philosophy is not necessarily better in any way. Descartes gives 4 objections to this theory of atoms. Democritus gives no satisfactory explanation of how particular things arise merely from the interaction of these corpuscles. He says Democritus attributes gravity to these corpuscles, when gravity should instead be regarded as functioning in relation to the position and motion of other bodies. Democritus further imagined a vacuum surrounding the atoms. I think the more important of these 4 is that Democritus held that atoms are indivisible. According to Descartes, we could always divide them in our thought, and this means we know them to be indefinitely divisible. Another interesting conclusion is that there can be no difference between celestial and terrestrial material, and thus no plurality of worlds. What he is denying here is the scholastic doctrine that there is a difference in kind between the incorruptible world of the heavens and what is observed here on earth. In terms of a critical analysis at this point, one might wonder if there is a philosophical way that Descartes' objections to atoms could be countered. He is effectively admitting of no distinction that would say that what could be indefinitely divisible in thought might be indivisible at some point in the imagination. If we take a thing of any size, we could express it in numerical terms. We could always continue to divide by 2. But does that mean it can always be split in imagination or in physical reality? David Hume, in his book A Treatise of Human Nature, argues against infinite, or Descartes' indefinite, divisibility, to the effect that we would come to some definite point where we cannot have a mental image of something being any smaller. As for Descartes' claim that free will is self-evident, it may not appear to be so if we fully describe it as a spontaneous, uncaused cause, or a condition that is itself unconditioned. When our actions sometimes seem mysterious, our failure to know for certain that another cause is at play does not indicate the truth of free will. It would be an anomaly or an outlier in a clockwork universe, and some may argue that it is inconsistent with a mathematical rationalism. As for myself, I do not believe it involves a contradiction to suggest that even in such a world where other animals may be slaves to their genes, evolution, if not God, may produce a species whose thought can produce a strong enough will to sometimes override an instinct. Another item is his procedure of using what happens with large bodies as a model for what happens to bodies that are too small to be perceived. Quantum physics suggests that the very small can violate laws that apply to the normal size, but this is yet another discovery of a later century. It would be grossly unfair to criticize Descartes for not being aware of this. but is his argument tenable? Descartes gives no reason other than that it seems reasonable and gives an advantage. The counter-argument to this would be to describe the situation differently. All our ideas about how objects operate are based on observing what we can see, and Descartes has an invisible God being very different. Descartes previously argued that it does an injustice to reason to suggest that what can be known can be restricted to what we can perceive, in arguing that the very small can exist. By the same logic, does it not also do an injustice to reason to suggest that it cannot imagine different sets of laws governing the too small to be visible? I will have reason to bring this up later. Descartes published his Passions of the Soul in the year before his death. Much of that work that I will skip is about exactly what is announced in the title. In it, he also attempts to answer what is the big and really deep question in metaphysics: how a consciousness and a material body can communicate with each other in such a way that cause and effect relations can occur. He goes beyond merely asking if body and mind both really exist, or merely arguing that his theory with its assumptions has explanatory power. He will try to explain by what process an immaterial and a material substance can affect each other in a cause and effect relation. Descartes will bring in some ideas from the principles of philosophy in his attempt to explain by what mechanism I might feel pain when a limb is injured, and a body part might move in a way that corresponds to my will, as well as perception. Descartes starts off his Passions of the Soul with the idea that the difference between mind and body is the way to understand the soul. Nothing acts on the soul more than the body to which it is conjoined. So an action of the soul is usually also an action in the body. As a rule, we shall attribute to the body anything that we experience as being in us, and which we can also see as existing in inanimate objects. Anything we cannot conceive as belonging to the body we shall attribute to the soul. An application of this is that since we have no conception of the body as thinking, we have every reason to believe that every kind of thought belongs to the soul. As for the functions of the body, Descartes will refer to the equipment of the heart, brain, muscles, nerves, arteries, and veins. He relies on the function of the circulatory and nervous systems. His short explanation of what physically happens is that the movement of the muscles depend upon nerves. Our sensations of any pleasure or pain from the body use the nervous system in the other direction. He describes the nervous system as like little threads or tubes coming from the brain and containing, like the brain itself, a certain very fine air or wind, which is called the animal spirits. We have in this wind a particle too small to perceive that may potentially explain the interaction between the body and mind. Although he characterizes the spirits collectively as an air or wind, he says what I am calling spirits here are merely bodies. They have no property other than that of being extremely small bodies which move very quickly. They also never remain in one spot. They make up the liveliest and finest parts of the blood, which will separate themselves from other parts. The spirits will also travel through the nervous system. As for what corporeal principle allows the system to function, Descartes claims that there is a continuous heat in our hearts as long as we live. It constitutes a kind of fire that is the corporeal principle. As blood returning to the heart enters the cavity, it gets heated, expands, and is rarefied. As a result, this blood gets forced into the other cavities of the heart, forcing the phenomenon that we call a heartbeat. This then leads the blood to circulate to the whole body. The finest parts of the blood are directed to the brain, and only the finest particles enter its narrow passages. These finest particles of the blood make up the animal spirits. All that is needed for spirit production is for finer parts to be separated from the coarser parts of the blood. The pores of the brain conduct them into the nerves, and then the nerves can transport them to the muscles. In addition, like the brain, the muscles already have some spirits absorbed in them at any time that are received from blood circulation. The soul is joined to the whole body and cannot exist in any one part. The soul has no relation to extension, which is why we cannot conceive of a divisible soul or its dimensions. It is related to the organs that are related to each other as a unity. This is why the soul becomes no smaller when a limb is lost. Nevertheless, according to Descartes, there is one part of the body where the soul exercises its functions more particularly than in the others. Descartes claims there is a very small gland in the middle of the brain, suspended above the passage through which the spirits pass between the brain's anterior and posterior cavities, which is the pineal gland. He tells us in section 31 of part 1, the slightest movements on the part of this gland may alter very greatly the course of these spirits, and conversely any change, however slight, taking place in the course of the spirits may do much to change the movements of the gland. Descartes goes on to give an argument against any other location being the seat of the soul, based on the unity of a perception that comes from more than one sense organ. Other parts of the brain are double, as are eyes, ears, and hands. There must be some place where the double images or impressions get unified into a single image or impression in our actual experience. These impressions and images are unified in this gland by means of the spirits that fill the cavities of the brain. It is only as united in this gland that we do not, for example, see two of everything by virtue of having two eyes. Descartes also argues that this is the location of the seat of the passions as well. Many people may assume that the seat of the passions must be the heart, because some of the passions are felt there. Descartes assures us that this is an illusion, because there is a nerve that descends to the heart from the brain. It is in a similar way that nerves will lead to a pain from a foot injury being felt as if it was in the foot. Animal spirits in the nerves and in the blood make it easy to imagine examples of how the soul and body interact through the nervous system. It allows perception from the body and the movement of body parts in accordance with the will. Descartes also uses this to explain situations where thought is not involved, such as the fight or flight behavior when we perceive a potentially dangerous animal, as well as the arousal of passions. Regarding perception as a process allowing an external object to affect us, let's say we start by having two images of an animal, one in each eye. The optic nerve at the back of the eyeballs send these images into the cavities of the brain. The spirits in these cavities radiate these images to the gland. The movement associated with each of the two separate images are pointed to the same part of the gland. This is how Descartes says the two images on the brain form only one image on the gland, which acts directly upon the soul and makes it see the shape of the animal. So does he have you convinced? As for myself, even if we grant him his medical opinions, I am not convinced that he has even given any explanation really of how extended substances and unextended substances can interact in a way that produces cause and effect relationships. The unstated premise seems to be that extended particles so small that they are close to being unextended can make a translation between the two types of substances. He does not say this, but it looks like his argument depends upon it. This is inconsistent with his earlier claim that we should use what happens in visible objects as a model to determine what happens in objects too small to be visible. To be fair to Descartes, on the whole, I don't think his theory should seem all that strange in our age that accepts quantum physics, the presence of an electrical current in the brain, light being subject to gravity, and matter being translatable into energy. This particular part of Descartes' philosophy has not been influential. Other ways of dealing with the mind and body problem have been threefold. One way is to declare it to be part of the unknowable. This is effectively the position taken by any philosopher who believes there are limits to what we can know and spurns metaphysics as beyond those limits. Other ways work around the problem. They reject this Cartesian dualism of both body and mind, sometimes famously labeled as the ghost in the machine. Instead, one can deny mind or matter, or have one or the other not be what Descartes thinks it is. And this involves making what we call matter ultimately mental, or making what we call mind ultimately material. A third option was taken by Descartes' immediate successor in the rationalist tradition, Benedictus Spinoza. If Descartes was right that God is the only true substance in the full sense of the word, we can imagine that God is the one and only substance that constitutes the totality of all things. Well, that's all for now. If you liked it, check out my other videos, send links to your friends, and thanks for watching.